There we go. Lovely. Well, thank you very much. There seem to be a lot of people out there. I have given this talk in various places, but I have changed it slightly. And the reason for that is that I have been asked quite a lot about the current situation because of neonicotinoids and being told that farmers can't grow it anymore. So I am going to have a little bit at the end on that. So this is roughly what I'm going to cover. An introductory bit about the history of it, how the plant itself grows, then the beekeeping thing, how we can manage the colonies, harvest and handle the honey, and then at the end, a little bit of pros and cons and thinking about the farmer. Can the farmer still grow oilseed rape, and what's the up-to-date situation on that? I've got 3 points that I'll stop if people have questions at that stage. If not, please just keep them obviously to the end. So starting with the background of it, it is a brassica, Brassica napus subspecies oleifera, and it's thought that this arose in the Eastern Mediterranean, and it's a natural hybrid between a cabbage, which is oleracea, and turnip, which is B. rapid. It goes back a very long way. This is a rather nice botanical drawing showing all the bits of the plant with the flowering stem. This is the stem with the taproot, the little seeds, and these are the seed pods. So the evidence back in Europe using it for lamp oil goes right back to the 11th century, and it was often known as poor man's oil because it did tend to smell rather badly then. And the seeds have a high oil content. That's where the oil comes from, is the seed. And this delightful picture is of 11th century oil lamp. So you would put the oil in there with a wick. And there's another one and with an example of it, one being lit to show it would give quite a good light. So if you're prone to power cuts, you can always try your oilseed rape. It is a very beautiful flower, I think. Now, the oil has a huge number of uses. And back in the Industrial Revolution, it was used particularly widely as a lubricant and in the manufacture of soap. During the drainage of the fens, which was done by the Dutch engineers, they planted very large areas with rape. And of course, it's still grown a lot in East Anglia and the fens. And in Hull, crushing and extracting, this is to get the seed, the oil out of the seed, that was really big business until the middle of the 19th century. But the growth of the petrol industry caused a major decline. So just as we see nowadays where shipbuilding has disappeared in some places, it had a devastating effect in Hull for quite a while. And then in the 20th century, there was a move away from butter because it was thought to be bad for the heart. Cholesterol was coming to the fore. And so vegetable oils were being used to make margarine, which was seen to be much healthier. But then, and the whole history of this is them finding something wrong with it. There's a major component in rape oil called erucic acid. That was found to be harmful to the heart. So they had to try and do something about that. And in those early days, the honey was incredibly hard and smelly. This was the spoon bending stuff, very pale and very, very hard indeed. And it got a very bad reputation. But plant breeding came into its own. And first of all, it managed to reduce this erucic acid content quite dramatically. And so the cooking oil use increased again, as it was seen to be really rather good. Then when the oil's extracted, you've got an awful lot of plant material left. and that was used for animal feed very widely. It still is now in many places. But then, of course, after a bit longer, they found a problem with the animal feed as they were using it a lot. It was predominantly pigs, sheep, and cattle. And they discovered that the harm was caused by something called glucosinolate. So the plant breeders get going again, of course, to reduce that. Now, in Canada, and in the States, and in a lot of countries, it's called canola. When I prepared this a few years ago, I'd never quite understood what canola stood for. And in fact, it's the Canadians that reduce the levels of glucosinolates. And the varieties are then called double low erucic, low glucosinate. And canola stands for Canadian oilseed low acid, or sometimes double low. But of course it is oilseed rape. It's just called something different in a different country. So the erucic acid levels dropped from round about 50% to right down 0.1, 1.5. And oleic acid content was higher, which is a good thing. And these glucosinolates are way down to less than 10% of the original. So you have an oil that is really quite beneficial, or we thought. Now, erucic acid, this is intriguing. It's actually a monounsaturated omega-9 fatty acid. Now, we all know about omega-3 and omega-6, and they are good news, but omega-9 is not. And it's been shown to have adverse effects on the human heart. Earlier on, the work was done in rats, and that did give actually rather false results, because it was discovered subsequently that the rat metabolizes it far differently, but nevertheless, it is not good, does not have a good effect on the human heart. So we want that erucic acid low for the oil to be safe. Now, there is a problem. what's what this is, I can never remember. It stands for the Agricultural Horticultural Development Board. And they're an executive, non-departmental public body. And they do a lot of research on the plant side. And they put out a leaflet on this problem and say it's a problem that's probably being evolved for decades, which seems bizarre. If they're using double low strains, why should that be? Now, the current permitted level in the EU is 5% and in the US 2%. The EU is just about to bring that down to 2% as well. But some batches of oilseed rape have been coming through with rather high levels. And that does not seem to make sense if they are growing double low varieties. So quite a bit of work has been done on this by this AHDB, and they've discovered that oilseed rape volunteers, that's those plants that come up on their own, and they come from old seed. And some of those old seeds could well be high producers of erucic acid. That's the major cause. And also, interestingly, a lot of weed species. Some of that perhaps is what you would expect, because it's a brassica, and most of these are brassicas, bittercress. And this is the volunteers, which were high erucic acid ones. They might have more than 45%. Charlock, black mustard, hedge mustard. Now they're not surprising. The one that did surprise me is cranesbill, because cranesbill is a wild geranium. These all look very like a brassica, don't they? This is bittercress, very bittercress, and these look very similar. They're clearly mustardy brassicas, but this geranium is really quite a surprise. So these weeds, which are widespread, very common in the UK, can be a problem. But they go on modifying all the time. because there are all sorts of demands. We change our minds about what we want, and this is carrying on. So, for example, the bitter taste came from isothiocyanates. That's now been reduced. And they've upped the content of alpha-linoleic acid because that is a goodie. So we do have an oil which is particularly good. I loved this picture. Yet another acronym, HOL. So this is high oleanic, oleic and low linolenic fatty acid profile. And this comes from the Bayer webpage, and they emphasize, of course, that it was achieved by conventional breeding methods. In other words, no GM. Now, I'm going to pause there in case anybody has any questions to ask before I move on.
Let me have a look through. What is OSR a hybrid of? I heard cabbage, but missed the other one. So they're just asking you to repeat what it's a hybrid of.
It was a turnip and, hang on, do you want me? Let me just show you that first slide. Where are we? Here we go. A natural hybrid, turnip and cabbage. Okay.
Okay, I think that was the.
There are.
What is the best variety? I don't know whether that's the best variety of OSR.
Oh, there are masses and masses of them, and each producer will claim that some of theirs are the best. They all have somewhat exotic names, but there really are dozens and dozens of them. And I think some of them are better on particular soils than others. And I think farmers find particular strain or variety that they prefer, but there are a huge number.
Someone's asked, why would we worry about GM? Red grapefruit is GM. I'm assuming genetically modified.
Why would we worry? Well, the UK was extraordinarily antagonistic to GM and the EU. So GM plants haven't been accepted here. And of course, the early GM ones were these Roundup Ready varieties of things. And there still is a very deep suspicion of GM, which I think is understandable, but it's a great pity. My own view on GM has always been that I would not like to treat all GM as terrible, but I wouldn't like to accept some GM. The sad thing was that they tried to introduce GM crops that we honestly did not really need in this country, and it got such a bad name that most of the industry are very wary of GM.
Okay, there are a couple of others. When plants are modified for human purposes, whether for appearance or taste, this often adversely affects pollen and nectar production. Is all this tinkering a problem for bees?
I'm not sure that I heard all of that. Were you saying it was adversely affected pollen?
Pollen and nectar, yeah.
No, that's a complete misunderstanding. Some people have said, oh, they planted rape near me and it's not any good. I think you'll find it's, as we'll come to later on, it's so dependent on the weather. And if you have not got the right weather, the very best of varieties will not produce, full stop.
Yeah. Okie doke. There are a couple more, but I think they're going to be answered in either the next bit or the third section. So we'll leave those for now.
Right.
So as you were.
Okay. So now we're going to look at the oil around the world, so to speak. So early on in the 60s, there wasn't very much. and then this gradual increase. And then when we got to the 80s, an absolute dramatic increase. And it is a very major crop worldwide. I've only got the main countries here. As you can see, there's quite a lot of them because it's impossible to read too much. And this is up to 2016, I managed to get figures for. We're in red along here. So you see we're low. The interesting thing is that America is not on there. I have got it now on a table, and it's right down here, lower than us. I think it's because America grows so much soya, because Canada grows a lot. And the last figure I got, 2016, Canada was the highest. But you can see the massive increase starting from 65 up to these huge, this is million metric tons per year. So enormous. China, Canada, and then India, still big producer. We're relatively low and we have got other European countries higher than us. But you can see it's a big seller. So it's a lot of money, a very valuable crop indeed. And obviously it's used as a vegetable oil, cooking and frying, very widely still for animal feed. Increasing interest in its use for biodiesel, and there have been some modifications for biodiesel. And there's this wide range of other things, cosmetics, detergents, lubricants, of some very mysterious lubricants, actually. In the list, it said sexual. I didn't like to inquire too much as to what that was. I thought this was rather useful. This comes from the Irish tea gas, which is sort of like our DEFRA, really, as it summarizes here actually the amounts they get. So at harvest, and this enormous amount of oil you get from it. And remember, this is Ireland. We love chips, vegetable oil, food for chips, biodiesel, hydraulic oil, and of course, nectar, producing rape honey, rape meal, which produces milk, meat, and other industries. So a terrific number of uses. Its nutritional value is interesting because it contains polyunsaturated fatty acids, usually called PUFAs, and these are called essential oils, and they're very valuable for eyesight and for the heart. Mostly omega-6. There is some omega-3, which is a really valuable one. Most omega-3 in our diet comes from animal, but there is omega-3 in this and linoleic acid, so they're all very good. In contrast, palm oil is very high in saturated fatty acids, which is why, apart from the damage it does to the various places they destroy to grow it, is why it's so disliked by many people. This again is from tea gas. I thought this was extremely good. If you look at oilseed rape and olive oil, they are the most, I think we say most balanced and good. The lowest level of saturated fat is in oilseed rape, and olive oil is quite low. And the oleic is quite high. If you look at palm oil, it is really particularly bad. I don't think we use coconut oil much, but it's certainly pretty bad. But palm oil has this huge level of saturated fat. So oilseed rape compares very favorably with olive, and this is what is done with it. This is local to me, Sussex Gold, and they bottle it just like olive oil. You know, this is cold pressed, extra virgin, to compete with the other market, which I think is quite clever because it looks very like the best of them, virgin olive oil. The plant itself, well, as we say, it's Napuspus subspecies olifera. It's a typical insect. I emphasize this because you will find time and again it is down as wind pollinated. which I think is quite wrong. It will be pollinated by wind because the flowers are tall and it gets blown around. Lots of plants can be wind pollinated, but one look at it will tell you that it has developed to attract insects. It's got a flat, open flower. They're conspicuous, coloured, very strong scent, and the nectar has a high sugar content. So clearly, that plant did not develop to be pollinated by wind because it wouldn't need to be coloured, smelly, high nectar content. So it's very definitely an insect pollinated flower. And the flowers are arranged in what's called racemes, with lots of flowers on each stalk. So these big main stalk with all these side branches and these delightful little four-petaled typical brassica. Used to be called cruciferae, this family. Shame they changed that name because actually cruciferae meant a cross. And 4 petals and sepals, and 4 long stamens and 2 short ones. You can actually see them in that picture. Very beautiful. And this illustration again, just to show you, here they are, the long stamens and the short ones. And these are the pods as they're ripening. And this, when it ripens, the outer bits open out and the seeds are inside here. The nectar has a very high sugar content, which is why bees love it so much. It can be as high as 60%, but it's very often between 30 and 40%, which means that the bees will really go for it. It's glucose and fructose with some sucrose, and bees will travel a long way to rape if the weather's right, but the weather does have to be right. So even if it gets pollinated by wind, pollination by insects results in a much better seed set, which is at least 20% heavier. And the benefits of it are also that the seeds all ripen at the same time, and there's a uniform crop and fewer unripe seeds. These are things that are very important to the farmer. Very important, because left to its own devices with no insects around, they will ripen at different times and there'll be an awful lot of unripe seeds. So a good insect pollination is much better. Now, quick look at actually growing it, because I do think it's important that we know how our major crops for bees are grown. And mostly it's winter rape. I'm not going to talk about the spring sown summer rape. The bulk of it we have is winter rape. That is sown in August, September, and these little low rosettes are formed, and vernalization, that means winter cold, is required. And it's not till the early spring that the main stems come up. So here we are with these lovely rosettes over the winter. Now, this is from a farmer. We're going to come to some bits at the end. And this farmer who got a good crop this year was saying the main emphasis is on a really early establishment like this. These are very healthy looking plants. And they drill it early and make the best use of nutrition. We'll come to that several times. It's quite an interesting one. And here we are in the spring, and they're just beginning for the main stem to shoot up. Unfortunately, this little flea beetle, cabbage stem flea beetle, is feeding on the developing flower head. This is a major pest and can be a real problem. This is where it's attacked even the tiny plants, and that obviously plant is not going to come to much. So that flea beetle is a problem. This is the damage to the main stem if the beetle's burrowed into it. You can see the damage it's done and the grubs inside as it lays its eggs in there. So flea beetle is a major problem. But then the plant, these tall stems come up, and then these are just pictures of as it goes through its stages, with the yellow fades to green, and then you get the seed heads forming before they harvest it. So I'm going to pause there in case there's any more questions on that particular section. Silence.
Has the height of OSR plants decreased over time?
Has it decreased?
Yes.
In some varieties, yes, but there's still a number that are very tall. And there's I say the variation of them is quite interesting to go and look at the, when we come on to the end, the bit about the farmers. I picked up a lot of information from things like Farmers Weekly and this AHDB and Growers Weekly. And there's a lot of detail in there and of the huge range of varieties they have. And I think they will pick a variety that suits their area. I mean, if it's, for example, a very, very windy area, they might go for a slightly lower growing plant. But the tall ones are still in favour, because obviously the taller ones, they produce the flowers all the way up the stem. So they get higher number of flowers.
Why do bees find it so irresistible when it crystallises so readily and is less accessible as stores?
Sorry, can you say that again, Di? I'm sorry, it's me, my hearing.
Why do bees find it so irresistible when it crystallises so readily?
Well, they're not interested in the honey. They're usually just munching at the leaves. The honey is actually of no interest to them at all. They might eat some pollen, and they are basically that picture I showed you of the small plant just being nibbled. It's similar to the flea beetle you get if you're a gardener. You'll be familiar with flea beetle that can devastate anything, even radishes, and they just chew the leaves to pieces.
So the bees, why do the bees eat it to take the nectar if the nectar crystallises?
Sorry, say that again.
Why do the bees take the nectar when it crystallises, when they get it back to the hive?
Well, it doesn't crystallise. We'll be coming on to that. It doesn't crystallise straight away. There's plenty of time for it. And bees will go for anything they think is good. And it does not crystallise as quickly as ivy. And ivy is covered in bees. They love it. They're not really interested in that. It doesn't crystallise in their stomach. And also, of course, bees can cope with crystallized honey anyway, to a certain extent.
There's a lot of questions about how much farmers treat the flea beetle by spraying and seed treating.
Shall we leave that to the last section?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I think that's it. I think there's lots about the pests and diseases.
Yeah.
So we'll leave that.
Okay. So actually, so this is us, if you like, managing the colonies for rape. Now, as it flowers so early, March to April, the colonies have got to have a large foraging force ready to make use of that, which means you need to be preparing now. If you know you've got rape out there, you've got to be thinking ahead. And certainly at the turn of the year, 6 weeks prior to anticipated flowering, colonies need to be fed syrup and pollen. So you see, 6 weeks earlier than March takes you, depending on the part of the country you're in, but in the south, that is very early. And and early in the year, in your hive, the proportion of larvae and pupae to foragers is high. So you have got to get those foragers up in numbers. And of course, in colder weather, because March is not exactly the warmest month, the bees don't fly very far, and fewer of them will be flying because it's only the foragers, and you probably only got young bees in the hive early on. So pollen supplements can be really valuable, as well as syrup, to get that colony built up. Remember, you need pollen to build up your young bees, and to go on for the young bees to be ready to be foragers. So this is the mistake that a lot of people make, is they're just not ready for it. So ideally, what you're going to have, you've got a good, strong colony headed by a nice young queen. So if you've had queens, if you raised some queens in the later part of the summer, you should have already put them in your colony now. So you've got a nice young queen. You want some frames of drawn comb. Don't make the mistake of putting in foundation early on. This is in a super. And you want a queen excluder and supers on as soon as the rape flowers. It won't be at that stage, but as soon as you're starting to see those lovely yellow flowers, make sure you've got on a super or drawn comb, and be ready with fresh supers. The reason for the drawn comb is that early on, yes, you've got some foragers, but they may not have all built up sufficiently. And it makes life much easier for them if they haven't got to draw wax. So they can take the first they collect of the nectar and put it straight into drawn comb. Now, if you're going to take colonies to rape, I actually have it sometimes right here outside the garden and just across the road. Get them in position before flowering commences fully. You don't want to leave it till it's like this picture. You want the first beginnings of yellow flowers. Ideally, put the colonies really close, but not right inside the rape, because if it goes mad, you can't actually get to the hive. Don't let weeds grow and block entrances. And of course, check with the farmer regarding spraying in case he is going to spray. The big asset of a good flow from rape is that you can get wonderful, fresh, drawn comb. If you're lucky enough to have a good year with warm enough weather, so it is producing a lot of nectar, you can put on brood comb, because it's very difficult to get decent drawn brood comb. And if you put it on that super, remember that you might land up with a great big brood chamber that's difficult to lift, but it's a wonderful way of giving you super drawn comb. So you start with the drawn, and then as the flow progresses, you put on undrawn. And if it's a good flow, you can get ever such a lot. I rather like using wide spacing and drone comb, of course, not for the brood, but for ordinary, because you can get those combs drawn out really fat and really wonderful. What do you have to remember though? Bait hives, because you are bound to miss some swarms, because you're building that colony up very fast. This is all assuming that you've got a good spring, of course, and it's not complete disaster and all you get is some pollen coming in. But the chances are you may miss them. So get out with your bait hives. But this is the crucial thing. This is the point about some people claiming that some newer varieties don't produce. It's got to be above 15 to produce scent. And in March, it often isn't. And you only need a few days of warm, sunny weather, and it's just turned on like a tap. And because I had it right outside me when I first started, I was out at work then, and I'd been told how they built up. And I would come and rush home, look at the colony, and be terribly disappointed because I couldn't see anything. And then I didn't look for it. And as a beginner, you know, you're always wanting to look at your bees. And then I left it for about 3 days. It turned warm, and I could not believe that this super was practically full. But it has got to be warm. If it's not, all they'll do is produce pollen. I think it is a stunningly beautiful crop. I couldn't resist this picture. I get a lot of deer here, and the pictures of the deer in the rape is so delightful. In the spring, if they've had young, it's a very good place for them to hide. They like that very much. Now, the important thing for us is harvesting that honey. Yes, it will set very quickly, but not immediately. But you've got to take that crop off as soon as the flowers start to fade. This is the key thing. All the while the fields are bright yellow, you should be okay. But the other mistake is to wait for all the cells to be capped. If you do that, you may well be too late and it may start to set. It's much better to risk taking some uncapped to make sure you get it off. Once you've got to this stage, it's too late. It really is. It will have started to set. Now, this depends on the way you keep your bees. Because I'm not very strong, and I've always found great difficulty in lifting supers, and I have them either here in the garden or I've taken them somewhere that I can get to easily. I take frames off as they're ready, so I never have many supers on. And a lot of people don't like doing that. I remove frames and shake and simply replace with undrawn comb. So I take them off, rush back home with them. Ideally extract immediately, but that's only going to be us small scale beekeepers. If you've got a lot, you probably can't do that. So then you've got to try and keep them either in the warm or in the cold to slow up the crystallization. If you've got new wax, so if you'd put in foundation, that can help slow it up. And immediate extraction is always going to be the best policy. If you can't do that, you have to accept the fact that you might well lose some of it, or rather some of it will set. Also, you need to remember that if you've taken the crop off, you could well need to feed the colony, because it will now be very strong. There'll be a huge brood, and suddenly you've taken off all this stuff. So put supers of extracted frames back on. That's a good idea, because they'll clean them up. But if necessary, you might need to feed. I must admit, the time I took, a couple of times I've taken mine to a local farm, I've been really lucky because they've had field beans, and the field beans have come into flower just as the rape is finishing, and that is great. Then how do you handle the honey, assuming you've taken it off in time? Do not leave it in the extractor even overnight. A friend did this, rang us all up and showed us this picture. He had this extractor and he was tired, he'd finished it, he went indoors, he thought, I'll leave it till tomorrow. And he got out and it all set in the extractor. And he then had to rig up some sort of, I don't know, I think he put wires, heating wires all round it. But if the weather or the extracting area is warm enough, filter it straight away. If not, at least run it into tubs, but don't leave it overnight because it will set. When it's unfiltered, so if you just run it straight off into tubs because you haven't got time and it's not really quite warm enough to filter, because filtering does need it to be reasonably warm, then it's going to take a bit more heat to liquefy. So tubs and leaving it to set often then is the best bet. Now, when you want to cream it, you have got to get it to about 32 to 35. And on a small scale, if you've only got the odd tub or two, you can just use a hand creamer. Actually, mine's a potato masher. Taking great care that you don't introduce air bubbles, so you keep that creamer under the surface all the time. Don't go too mad because you just introduce masses of air bubbles. You can see I'm not a professional, because if you were a professional, you'd have one of these fancy machines that does it. Now, why does it crystallize? Well, that's because it's got more glucose than fructose, and glucose will crystallize more rapidly than fructose. The joy of it, though, is these beautiful fine crystals. And this can give you an absolutely beautiful product. It's also wonderful to blend with other honeys. Now, this is from Enid. Enid Brown is one of our top honey judges. And just look at that. It is absolutely beautiful. That is creamed soft set rape. It's absolutely lovely. Wonderful texture. And it is so smooth. No nasty bits at all. No crunchy bits. And you can get that by creaming it. So suppose you've got some combs that did set. Well, I say it will be impossible. Some of it you can get out if it's partially. Hold the comb up to the light, and if it looks very slightly cloudy, it means some of it is setting. One way you can deal with it is to just give up on trying to save that comb. Chop it up into small pieces, warm it gently to separate from the wax. Tricky, because you have to be so careful with it. And you must not overheat the honey, because up goes the HMF and down goes the diastase. This is an enzyme that's very precious. And in the extreme, of course, you'll discolor it. Can do it, but not easy. So coming, I thought I got a gap. Never mind. Yeah, shall we have a gap there? I thought I should have had a gap there before I move on to the final lot. Any questions on that?
I'm just having a look through for anything about its setting. There are people agreeing it's a good way to get foundation drawn. So I am envious for that reason.
Oh yes, it's brilliant. Go to a rape area. It's so good for beginners who often struggle to get foundation of any kind. Foundation, to get drawn comb. And drawn comb is so, so precious. And it's so beautiful. It's a glorious, I'm so silly. I should have got some decent pictures of beautiful new comb that's just been drawn out. It's a joy to see. It's a lovely, creamy white, pure wax, and it looks beautiful. It really does. So it is terrific.
So how close do your bees have to be to it? How close?
Well, if you're moving hives to rape, you would put them around the edge of the field, but not right in the rape. You want to just 3, 4, 5 feet away. My garden, I have a very, very long boundary, and it is immediately over the fence. But I then sometimes have it across the estate opposite, and that's 1/4 to 1/2 a mile. And that, the last year they had rape that grew very, very well. I got practically nothing because it was dismal weather. They were going, because I could see them coming back with that wonderful pollen, but no way did they get anything much in the way of nectar. And you couldn't blame them because it was windy, damp, drizzly, and thoroughly horrible. So I doubt that I think it might have touched 15 now and then. But another year, when it was immediately behind me, I mean immediately behind me, the hives were about 10 to 15 feet away, and I would walk through it with the dog, and I would look at it and think, where the hell are my bees? I would hunt, and I could see some collecting pollen. Then the weather turned hot, and it was spectacular. Absolutely spectacular. But you have got to have the right temperature. I can't emphasize that enough. But okay, any more?
There's questions about it being grown with a cover crop or using companion planting against the beetle.
Yes, we could probably do that at the end with
Right,
a bit.
okay.
Yeah.
I think that's it.
Okay. So pros and cons in terms of us. You will almost certainly get some, even in a bad year. You won't get supers full. I mean, I think I landed the first fantastic year of a wonderful rape crop, which was my first proper year. I think I got 70, 80 pounds a colony, which is amazing for the country. It really is. The bees love it. They really do. They'll travel a very long way for it if it's warm. And when creamed, of course, as I've shown you, it is lovely. And you can mix it with stronger honeys. If you've got honey, well, if you think you've got some privet in your honey or something and you're not too sure about the taste, mix it with rape and you will get a lovely mix. And again, a lovely picture from Enid. You can win wonderful prizes in shows with this beautiful soft set rape. It's lovely. It's not that nasty spoon bending stuff there used to be years ago. So that, if you're a show person, that's a huge pro. And we've already mentioned, and I think lots of people will know, terrific way of getting drawn comb. Excellent for bringing on nukes. If you've got some nukes, pop them out, because they've got all, even if you haven't got a very good flow, you'll have loads and loads of pollen. You can see it here, that it produces copious amounts of pollen. And the honey does not smell unpleasant. What else? This seed for setting other honeys, this is very, very useful. We don't always know what honeys we've got, but we know if we've got rape. And these fine crystals can help you set others. So what you do is liquefy. If you've got a nasty coarse one that all sort of lumpy and horrible, you must warm that one to at least 52 and keep it there for a while so that you get rid of every one of those coarse grains. Don't just take it till it looks clear, because it won't be. Keep it at 52, then cool it. You must cool it, and then you can add rape as a seed and cream it up, and you'll get a beautiful, beautiful mixture. But there are disadvantages. It can be hard work. Constant vigilance. You can't just take colonies out to rape and forget about them. Well, you can, but it would be pretty bad news. Great care over the extraction. And I think this is a bit of a snag. It can lead to subsequent crops setting in the comb from crystals that are left in the cells, and you can't see that, of course. But it means you've got to take care another year if you've had rape previously, because you might find something is setting that you don't expect to. This, of course, the ever-present risk of swarming, because they've got this rapid build-up. Now, some people have claimed that colonies can get bad-tempered toward the end of the flow. I'm not sure that in the days when I did go more regularly to rape, I don't think I really noticed that. Some people have suggested it might be that if they're on one particular crop, this could be with anything, there might be deficiencies in amino acids. I'm not sure. And of course, some people, but this is very much personal tastes, find the honey a bit too bland. But overall, I think we have to say, as far as we're concerned and the bees, it is very beneficial. But we have to remember the farmer. What about the farmer? Is it still a viable crop? Because the use of seeds treated with neonicotinoids, it's been banned. This has had an effect on both growing and managing. This is just to remind you, that's when the flea beetles had a go at the, see what it does. I mean, that's really bad news if it happens that early on, and there it is munching away in the middle of it. That is not good. But there've been very varied reports on this. What is interesting, when I read through these various things to get some data for this year, I've got some data just coming to on crops for this year. These farming things are a little bit like our newspapers. Some are like the Daily Mail and the Daily Express, they're shock horror. And some are a little bit more rational, and some are a bit more cheerful. But they are obviously very varied, and I've tried to be fair-minded in what I've picked out. So some are claiming that the problems mean that far less will be grown. Others are disagreeing with that. This is the major pest, of course, this cabbage stem flea beetle. It also gets a fungal disease and a viral disease. But the thing is, all crops get diseases. And if you do go to these things like the Farmers Weekly and these other Growers Weekly and so forth, you will find that they have a roundup of all crops, and you wonder sometimes whether they're ever able to grow anything, because it is a battle. It is if you're a gardener. Look at this year. Not only have you got the pests and diseases, you've got the problem with weather, and that is really difficult. So how have we done in 2020? Well, this is one I picked out. These, I looked at the ones that were published in about August, September, which is when harvest was taking up. So the oilseed rape harvest picked up pace under sunny skies. Number of good-looking crops producing only average yields after an extremely difficult growing season. Now, that doesn't mean the diseases. It means, if you recall, depends what part of the country you're in. Here in Sussex, the fields were underwater in January, February, and early March. The oilseed rape planted about the half a mile away looked pretty good in the autumn, because our autumn was tolerable. It then got wetter and wetter, and it was then underwater, and it was disastrous. But it was not because of the beetle. And then we have, following a scattering early, very disappointing crops, many have yielded in the 3 to 3.5, this is tons per hectare. Now, the overall yield last harvest, that's 2019, was 3.3. So remember that figure. So keeping that as an average, we then get the doom and gloom, the Essex one. Mr. Kerr, oilseed rape was a failure. We just combined it. That's flea beetle for you. He doesn't say, mind you, whether he also had wet, because Essex is heavy clay. However, these are all straight from these magazines. Down on the Isle of Sheppey, Brian McCormack is seeing average yields and not too much of a pest problem. So he's not doing badly. These are all the dead seed heads here that they're collecting. And then you go around and you can see how variable it is. Pembroke, and he has been pleasantly surprised. So that is right up in Wales. And he said had cabbage stem flea beetle damage with a wet winter and the drought, but we're achieving 4.2 tonnes per hectare. So that is more than 1990, which is pretty good. Even up in the Scottish borders. So he's saying he's waiting for his rape to ripen. And this was middle of August. And we've had some failed crop, but what's left looks all right. So again, extremely variable. This is interesting. I picked this up a lot, and I think you've got to hand it to farmers that they are being adaptable. They have focused on crop establishment and nutrition, and is pushing them towards the 5 tonnes per hectare barrier. 5. That's way above the 3.3. And I've picked up a lot. For example, some of them are growing the rape in between other crops as protection, mainly protection from flea beetle. And if you grow cabbagey things in the garden, you know, you can ward it off by growing other things around your brassicas. This is a lovely one. Ashley Jones has been delighted. This picture's appeared in all of the magazines. I thought was lovely. So he's got just over 4 tons per hectare. That's the name of one of the varieties. And that's the highest he's had on his place in Cornwall. And I'm finishing up with this. This isn't my hyperbole, but comes from the magazines. Has just harvested a monster oilseed rape crop yielding just over 7 tons. That's over double the average of last year. In spite of pest problems and a dry spring, best ever yield 7.04, which is just under the world record. I think that is amazing. And a combination of autumn foliar feeds and pyrethroids. Pyrethroids were what were being used before neonicotinoids. And you probably recall, pyrethroids are relatively benign insecticides. Okay, they're an insecticide, but they are not too damaging if they're used sensibly, but they were a spray. And when the neonicotinoids came out, I must admit, I thought it sounded great, because you hate to see these great big spray arms going along and you think, what damage are they doing to other things? And it sounded marvelous that you could treat the seed and the seed would have the insecticide in it and it would permeate throughout the plant. But it's only subsequently, of course, that we found that permeating throughout the plant meant that it gets into the bee. And I know there have been huge arguments. I personally believe very much that it does affect honeybees. It's certainly been shown to affect bumblebees because they're much easier to do experiments on. It's desperately difficult to prove it with honeybees, and some of the other successful ones have emphasized, a couple of those other earlier ones, they are using careful cultivation, and the foliar feed, which they're using in the autumn and sometimes again in the spring, they used to count the flea beetle before they used the sensible farmers, the good environmentally aware ones. You can't knock all farmers. Some of them have always been excellent, and they would count the flea beetle and only spray when the beetle level reached a certain numbers. So overall, I think we have to conclude that, is it still viable? Yes, but certainly the farmer has got to be vigilant over feeding it. Oh, sorry about that. That should be flea beetle as early as possible. But I think we can conclude that we're not going to say goodbye to oilseed rape if we've got 2 or 3 farmers there who've broken all records in a very difficult year. So thank you very much for your attention. And if there are any other questions, I will try and answer them.
There are absolutely loads of questions about creaming honey.
Oh, really?
Yes. And I don't know whether you want to go into that or whether we need to actually have a whole talk on creaming honey.
Well, could I recommend also that you buy our special issues? We've got one on honey, and there was also in the advanced husbandry one. If you're larger scale, you can actually buy fancy bits of equipment for it. But if you're dealing with just the odd tub or 2, it literally is mushing it up and down with something like that. You can buy official ones, but a potato masher works awfully well. And the idea is that you're breaking up the crystals and distributing them well. And it, because the rape crystal is so tiny, it works really, really well. If you're mixing it with another honey, you've got to take great care. But the really important thing, if you do your general husbandry, you need to know all these temperatures. The coarse honey you have got to take up. I know some people don't like heating their honey, but you've got to, because if it's a coarse honey, people make the mistake of waiting till it looks clear and thinking it's okay. You've got to make sure you are above 50. Try not to go above 55, but between 50, 55, and hold it for a bit, because you have to get rid of every last crystal. Cool it so it's still slightly warm. Take your rape honey and warm it gently, but do take care, you mustn't warm it beyond the low 30s till it goes like porridge, is usually the best description. And you can then take out, you only really need 10%, but it doesn't really matter, you can use more. And put that into your runny but cooled honey, coarse honey, and then mush it around with this sort of potato masher type thing. And do that at intervals, and it will gradually thicken. And you will have this really nice creamed, excuse me. Sorry, I didn't turn the phone off. Yes. So is that enough?
Should you have it at a specific temperature as you're leaving it to go to soft set?
Sorry, should you what?
What temperature should you have it at to make sure it goes soft set when you've finished that process of mixing it?
Well, once you've bottled it, the soft set will remain soft set, and keep it, well, depends where you keep your honey, of course. Most people will keep it at room temperature. But once it's creamed and has thickened, and you've got it in the jar, it's fine. You know, you keep your honey for quite some time, and it shouldn't break down.
Okay, thank you. I think that's answered everyone's questions on that. And there's another one. Has the farming community said how much oilseed rape they plan to grow next year? Will it be more or less than recent years?
No, I don't know. You can pick up these things occasionally, but I don't know. And obviously the farming world is a bit of a law unto itself. And it does seem to vary, because they did have these terrible doom and gloom stories before. And in fact, the amounts did not drop very much. They did drop, but not a huge amount. I thought it was very, very encouraging that there were so many reports of farmers saying that by using foliar feeds and judicious use where necessary of pyrethroids, I have a feeling that with the gap of having used neonicotinoid treated seed, it's allowed them to forget what they used to do with pyrethroids. Whereas, I say, the environmentally aware ones would count the beetles, and they would watch carefully, because sometimes they build up very quickly and sometimes they don't, so that they only then treated as and when they needed to. And I think it's obvious from what I have read there that a number of farmers are using other methods. I was particularly interested in the sowing clover between the rows and a whole range of other things, so that, quite surprising, the rape looked as if it was being overpowered by these things. But of course, the rape stands the winter quite well, and many of these other things don't. So the competition from the other plants seemed to be protecting them from flea beetle. So I think there are a lot of alternatives, and I think it's still going to be around for quite a long time. And it's such a valuable crop that I think it won't take much to tempt some farmers who perhaps got disillusioned. Some of them have tended to blame. We had a letter from somebody from Norfolk. No, not Norfolk, Lincoln. Well, the Lincolnshire wold farmer who had the world, almost broke the world record, that's the wolds, which is, I think, north. Lower down is the fens. And I remember a country file programme earlier this year, where apparently this time last year they visited this particular farmer, and he was rowing boats across his fields. The floods were appalling, and they visited him again and showed films of that in about February, when our fields here were almost underwater. Some of them were underwater. And the worst of the floods had gone, and he was left with an appalling sludge and had hardly any ground that he could sow anything on. Well, if you had planted crops on that, you can hardly blame flea beetle, can you? So it is a very mixed picture. And as I think keen gardeners will know how crucial the weather is. And this year has been particularly difficult. So I found it encouraging that they had got a number of people with very high yields, although obviously there are some that did have very poor results. So I think there's hope.
Thank you. There is one question that I'm going to ask. If the farmer is spraying or due to spray, what should the beekeeper do?
You need to discuss, obviously, if you're near, try and have a liaison with the farmer if you know you've got rape. And I think then, given that it's an early time of the year, you're not probably going to run the risk of too much heat. The best bet, really, it's not practical to move your hives away because the chances are they'll be too heavy, too big. So I think you have got to use foam in the front and close them up. Make sure you've got plenty of space in the top, another even empty super on top, and perhaps put some water on the top so that they're not shut in for too long, and make sure you know when he's going to spray, and then when the spraying's finished, let them out, but wait, depending on the time of the day and the weather, of course, because you don't want to let them straight out because they do pick up the moisture from the crop itself, and if they're using sprays they will be sucking up insecticide. But that's the classic way of dealing with a farmer spraying.
Thank you. There's a quite interesting comment from David Turner about their local farmer found the flea beetles weren't there in the morning, but they were there in the evening. So they sprayed at night because that's when the beetle was active.
That's very good. And that is the advice that they should be following, because used to, way back about 15 or more years ago, I think our recommendation farmer was early morning or late evening, and then we changed it because the bees get up a bit sooner though sometimes than we think, and so it was changed to ideally they should be spraying evening, not morning, and that is the best way of avoiding the bees flying. You certainly hope they're not going to spray in the middle of the day.
Yep. Is it okay to feed the set honey back to the bees in winter?
Is it okay to feed
the set honey, set oilseed rape honey in frames?
Well, what you can do is chop it up, because we don't get absolutely dreadful hard honey now. And if you've given up with some comb and you don't want to try and get it out, chop it in bits. And if you've got, you know, I forgot what you call them, the round feeder that you put the cup-like thing on, take a cup of, put it, or in just an open tray, put it up above the crown board. They will take a lot of it, and they quite like it. Chopped up in little bits. Remember the lovely Irish chap who died a few years ago? He gave a wonderful talk at Gormanston with pictures, and he hacked his all up in bits and had some lovely pictures of the bees feeding on it. And they will. And if you can warm it slightly before you put it on, it just gets the aroma out, releases the aroma. And you can, if you've got some frames where you've got some out and some's left, you can warm them slightly. I think Michael Badger, I remember talking once, he suggested that you stood them in some bucket of warm water and drained that slightly and popped those on, and the bees will quite often do quite a good job of cleaning them up. They are good at cleaning up frames, there's no doubt.
I think that is all we're going to have time for this evening. It is already 9:15.
Gosh, yes.
Thank you very much, Pam, for your lovely talk. I do now wish I had oilseed rape near where my bees are. Maybe I'll move one day and I'll put that on the list of things to look out for. So I'm sure everyone else would like to thank you as well. I will keep the comments and have a look at all of those. But thank you very much, everyone. And good night.
Thank you. Gosh, 243. Wow.